Hello, everyone. We're now going to go on to the second part of this chapter in this lecture, and we'll talk about other types of victimization. So we're going to start by talking about domestic violence. Again, quick disclaimer, if you're watching this one before the other one, these topics are difficult for some people, for a lot of people. I mean, this is hard stuff to hear about, but especially if you or someone you know has been a victim of this type of crime. So again, I actively encourage you to speak with your professor and to seek out care if you yourself need it, or support and resources. So estimates suggest that about 33% of men and 25% of women have been involved in some sort of physically aggressive altercation. Although in relationships, female to male aggression is as frequent as male to female aggression, male aggression is significantly more likely to result in serious injuries, which is why we end up talking about that more often. And about 30% of all the women murdered in the US each year are actually killed by their male partners. So there are some myths about battered spouses, and some of these are just exaggerated beliefs as well. And Fullingstad, 1984, is the person who identified this. So the idea that battered women are masochists, that they enjoy this in some way, no, right? They provoke these assaults inflicted on them. People have self-control, right? They get the treatment they deserve. No one deserves to be battered. They are free to leave these violent relationships anytime that they want to. If you watch the supplemental YouTube videos I've put up and look at some of the links, you'll see that one of the main reasons why people cannot just leave whenever is the time when you are most likely to die in an abusive relationship is when you try to leave it. So no, they can't just leave. And often their spouses have threatened them financially, threatened to harm or get full custody of their children, threatened to harm their pets or other people that they love. Violence isn't common. Unfortunately, it is, as we saw with some of the statistics already. Men who are nonviolent in their dealings with outsiders behave the same way in those dealings in their own homes. We know that that's not true. We can probably think about that from our own partners, that sometimes, or ourselves, we might be different in some ways, not violent, but just different in some ways than the face we present to the outside world. The idea that middle and upper class men don't batter and middle and upper class women don't get beaten. This does not a lower class problem, although a lot of people think that it is. And again, that's our next one, that battering is a lower class ethnic minority phenomenon, and such women don't mind because it's part of their culture. Again, everyone minds if they get beaten up, right? They might accept it because that's what they've seen, but they don't like it. Good, quote unquote, battered women are passive and never try to defend themselves. This is often used when the woman tries to defend herself and might end up harming or killing her spouse in self-defense. Clearly, I just have a hard time wrapping my head around something like that. So in terms of the causes of battering, batterers, or those who commit domestic violence, are more likely than non-batterers to be unemployed, less well-educated, members of a minority group, and also of lower socioeconomic status, and they tend to have suffered physical abuse themselves as a child or witnessed a physical abusive relationship. Now, you notice that some of these statistics do go with those myths, but it doesn't mean that people of other groups don't experience this. Batterers usually do have poor self-concepts. They're not really good at problem solving. They think this is the way to solve your problems. They have limited verbal skills, are prone to extreme jealousy, and thus they monitor their partner's activities closely and exert excessive control over their partner's whereabouts. Waltz et al. In 2000 revealed 3 distinct types of batterers, ones that are just generally violent, ones that are psychopathological, so that psychopathy, that antisocial personality disorder, and ones that only lash out at their family. These groups were distinguished by degree of violence within the relationship and the degree of general violence reported, as well as by personality characteristics. As many as 40% of people who are abusers or batterers have the features of borderline personality disorder, which is a severe disturbance characterized by unstable moods and behavior. So, battered woman syndrome is something that's talked about in your book and talked about in general in the literature in this area. This is something that I actually did a little bit of extra literature review research on when I myself was a graduate student. So I have a little bit more than your book has here. So about 1.3 million women are beaten by significant others every year in the U.S. 25% of women will be abused at some point in their lives while in a relationship. And again, similar to what we talked about in the last mini lecture with sexual assault, these numbers might actually be underreported. So what are battered women like? They often have low self-esteem, and again, similar to the sexual assault victims, will blame themselves for the abuse and feel guilty for it. Like the abusers, those who are abused were often abused themselves as children and saw their own mothers abused. MMPI data produce similar profiles to schizophrenics. They score high on the scale 4 on the MMPI, and there's a subscale of that scale that's family discord. Not surprisingly, they score high on that. They may suffer from depression and or PTSD as the result of the abuse. The abuse is often psychological and sexual as well as physical. And again, those threats to others are a part of that. And they come from all walks of life, and they're not just masochistic or passive. So battered woman syndrome is something that Lenore Walker came up with in 1979. And it was designed to explain battered women who kill their abusers. And it's based off of Seligman's theory of learned helplessness. And he developed this based on a series of experiments he did with dogs. And so he put them in cages where the floor was mesh and you could electrify it. Not enough to actually cause harm, but enough to be unpleasant. And for some of the dogs, he put a small wall that they could just hop over. And some of them he put a wall all the way up to the top of the cage. And what he found is that the dogs who could not get out, could not get away from the shock, the wall was too high to jump over, even when you took that out and had the smaller wall, they wouldn't try to escape the shock. And Seligman called this learned helplessness, that essentially they learned there's no way to get away, and so they just won't try anymore. And Walker argued that the strict gender roles in our society teach women that they have no control over their own lives, thus creating a similar experience of learned helplessness to Seligman's dogs that again, could not escape the shock. And this is made worse when you're abused because you feel helpless and you feel like there's no escape. And so she came up with this idea of the cycle of violence. That phase 1 she called tension building, that you were fighting, there was less severe abuse, and women would sort of withdraw. Phase 2 was acute battering, quote unquote, discharge of tension, and the woman was often injured in this phase. And then phase 3 was contrition, where the abuser was apologetic, the victim would drop any charges pressed, and the cycle would begin again. And this was supported by Walker's study that she published in 1984 in her book, The Battered Woman Syndrome. And it argued that the most significant predictor of battering was past violence on the part of the batterer. And this makes sense based on what we've talked about in past, right? It's consistent with the idea that past behavior is just the best indicator of future behavior. Verbal abuse accompanied physical abuse in over 80% of the battering incidents reported in the women in her study. Only 2/3 of the women who needed medical attention after being battered sought medical assistance. And 1/5 of the women in her study needed medical assistance after the first time that they were battered. Approximately 1/2 needed it after their worst episode. And battered women, she found, had higher levels of pain tolerance, which she said was consistent with her idea that women dissociated during the phase 2 battering incident, sort of spaced out, zoned out, and that may lead to distancing themselves from the pain. Physical abuse is part of the experience for battered women. They are reported being subject to all 8 forms of psychological abuse laid out by Amnesty International in their description of psychological torture used against prisoners of war. These areas of abuse include victim isolation, creating exhaustion, and you can do that by means of limiting food, interrupting sleep, monopolizing the victim's perceptions through the obsessiveness or possessiveness, threats of death of the victim or those close to her, degradation, forced drug or alcohol administration, use of hypnotic states to produce altered states of consciousness, and occasional indulgences that give the victim hope. Walker also argued that her theory or her study supported the learned helplessness component of her theory, in that women reported becoming less active and more passive as a way of coping with their situation. So 3/4 of the women she surveyed believed that their batterer would kill them. And battered women were often quite depressed, which is where Seligman's theory was originally used to explain depression. There was other research that supported this. So Gleason in 1993 found that battered women are more likely to be depressed, to experience psychosexual dysfunction, and to exhibit symptoms both of generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD. Arnon and Sagi in 1995 argued that battered women are more likely to tolerate violence in their marriage and blame it themselves for that violence. And these women were controlled by their husbands, less happy, and more nervous than non-battered women. And then Dunton and Painter showed evidence for 3 aspects they considered essential to battered women syndrome: low self-esteem, high rates of PTSD symptoms, and paradoxical attachment to the batterer in spite of his abuse. They found a battered women syndrome composite score made up of those 3 areas, accounted for by the intermediacy of abuse, the total amount of physical abuse, emotional abuse, and power shifting as the woman loses control and the man gains it. So can this be used in court, this battered woman syndrome? Can this be used as a defense for a woman, for example, who kills her husband, who has been abusive? It can be helpful because before this was developed, battered women were believed to be severely psychologically damaged. They believed that if you allowed your husband to beat you, it was because something was wrong with you. It removes responsibility from the woman and it dispels some of the myths. So Schuler, however, talked about, did a study where he had people who were experts, general experts, or specific experts around this area, either hear evidence about battered woman syndrome versus not, and those who heard battered woman syndrome evidence were more likely to reduce the charge. So, for example, bring it down to manslaughter or a different form of murder. They're also more likely to believe the woman was abused and feared for her life when they heard testimony about battered woman syndrome. There has, however, been some criticism. So Gordon described this as an inadequate term to represent the scientific and clinical knowledge concerning battering and its effects. And in terms of learned helplessness, that component of the theory, Seligman did adapt his theory to apply to humans. And Walker admits that she didn't use the human version of his theory. She used the dog version. So the emphasis on learned helplessness created a stereotype of passivity that obscures the reality of women's active strategies of help-seeking and survival. So another concern here is that you're saying women don't do anything to help themselves, but in some cases they do. Ferraro cites examples where women's cases have been hurt by the use of battered woman syndrome because they don't fit the stereotypical passive ideal. There are abused women who are outgoing, assertive, and strong, and who just cover stuff up really well, right? The battered woman syndrome construct has not only prevented many of these women from using a self-defense argument, But it has also stopped triers of fact from believing the women were abused if they didn't exhibit these passive traits. There's been some instances where the learned helplessness component hasn't actually been supported in the literature. Now, in terms of the cycle of violence, in Lenore Walker's own data, only 65% of the people showed phase 1, and only 58% showed phase 3. They all had to show phase 2 to be part of the study. So this idea that the cycle of violence is universal is actually problematic. So it might actually be the intermittency of the abuse, the fact that you don't know when it's coming, that's more problematic rather than this cycle in and of itself. In general, the cycle of violence isn't supported in the literature and is not actually necessary. And I believe Walker herself has kind of moved away from this in recent years. Now, what about the fact that we call this a syndrome? The definition of a syndrome is pathological condition, signs, and symptoms. So this pathologizes battered women. It sees them as dysfunctional. Hempel emphasized the term syndrome implies a disease, pathology, or some sort of mental illness or defect, and points out 2 problems with using battered women syndrome to describe abused women. First, it implies that as a result of battering, the woman in question suffers from a disease or mental defect. And second, battered women syndrome can be interpreted such that it appears women who have it were predisposed to be in an abusive relationship. Again, it sort of like puts the blame back on the victim. He argues that in many cases, neither is accurate. Battered woman syndrome is often seen as clinical jargon that may confuse the trier of fact as well. There were also some methodological problems in Walker's study. She'd had no control group. She asked the same women to report on their abusive relationships and their past non-abusive relationships. So you might have had a rose-colored glasses effect where they're kind of looking at the non-abusive relationships in a more positive light. There was a sampling bias. So it was women who came to a domestic violence shelter of their own volition, and they left the relationship after a moderate level of violence. These women were mostly middle class, and they're probably pretty different than women who cannot escape, right? So there were some discrepancies in the data. So just if you look at the text versus the figures in the book, they're different. That's never good. She makes assertions not based on the data she collected as well. So for example, she argues that batterers often have a strict father and an inconsistent mother. But in the next sentence she states, although we did not collect such data, it is reasonable to speculate that if we had, and goes on to make a statement related to this non-existent data. That's just not good psychological science. Can you use this in court? Well, it can reinforce negative myths by focusing on passivity and timidity of the women. Schuler found that expert groups see the defendant as less in control of her own actions and of his own actions, and see the women as pathological. Dutton argues that it's not only an inadequate defense, but it can mislead the fact finder. It doesn't help in explaining how the actions might be reasonable that the woman takes in self-defense. And it might be better instead to testify about battering and its effects in general. So what should psychologists do? When do they get involved? Well, when battered women kill their husbands, right, then psychologists come on board either to evaluate them or to serve as expert witnesses. So we look at duress, crimes committed by battered women under orders of their abusers. That's another option of when this happens. And then also child custody cases. So people will say, well, why couldn't the mother protect her child from being abused? They won't talk about the fact that it was the other spouse who was the abuser. Again, this blaming of the victim. Why might someone have abused the children? So sometimes the batterer forces the spouse to abuse the children. Why having PTSD or battered women syndrome doesn't preclude you from being a good mother, because that's the other concern. If you say, I have PTSD, well, now you have a mental disorder, and can we give the other person custody because you have a mental disorder? So if you're doing an evaluation in these cases, you need to be sure what legal question are we considering? Are we considering not guilty by reason of insanity? Are we considering a child custody case? And then you do the same type of evaluation we talked about earlier in the semester for that particular issue. In terms of the time needed, you also need to know the current literature on domestic violence, on battered women, on the syndrome in and of itself. In terms of the time needed, Walker said you need at least 30 hours for interview and record review. And an updated statistic in 2004 said that you need 6 to 20 hours just to interview the battered woman. You want to also interview witnesses and those close to her, the spouse if you can. Then you want to do record review, police reports, medical reports from when she went to the hospital, personal correspondences. In terms of testimony, expert testimony about battered woman syndrome, it may be more confusing than helpful according to research. It's more important to look at individual women's specific symptoms rather than a general discussion of the syndrome that may or may not apply to that particular woman. Judges, attorneys, expert witnesses, and advocates for battered women all agree that battered woman syndrome does not include all the information necessary to help the trier of fact, but general expert testimony on battering and its effect can actually be very helpful. And then just real quick about this, although battered woman syndrome was helpful at the time of its conception, it is now dated, and it's much more important to address general aspects of battering and its effects as they apply to abused women in question. Now, very briefly, we're going to talk a little more about sexual harassment. I know we've talked about this in passing already. So this is another crime where, again, it tends to be very gendered. Anyone can be sexually harassed, but we tend to see the majority of it being women who are sexually harassed. So it's fairly prevalent. So for example, a survey of 20,000 federal employees found that 42% of the female workers reported being sexually harassed on the job within the past 2 years. So a pretty big deal. And both men and women experience sexual harassment, and both men and women most often report that it is men who are the perpetrators. So how do we define it? It's unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. Submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly as a term of condition of your employment. Submission or to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions, such as hiring, firing, raises, promotions. And such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance and creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. The courts following EEOC guidelines have recognized 2 different types of sexual harassment. There's quid pro quo harassment, which is seen as an implicit or explicit bargain in which the harasser promises a reward or threatens punishment, depending on the response. So that's the first 2 bullet points above. And then hostile workplace environment involves demeaning comments, acts of touching or attempted intimacy, or the display of provocative photographs or artwork. So that's the 3rd bullet point above. To determine which types of harassment claims succeed, a study looked at 81 sexual harassment charges, and they found that sexual harassment charges were more likely to be resolved in favor of the complainant when the harassing behaviors were serious, when the complainant had witnesses, and when the complainant had given notice to management prior to filing formal charges. All right, so this was a difficult chapter, but I hope that you did learn, and I hope that it was useful to you.